Hello friends, welcome again. In today's video, we're going to see what is Dockerignore. So Dockerignore is a very important concept, or it's a hidden file that we maintain in the same directory where we are building the Docker image, right? So let's say we have a Docker file that any of the Docker file where we are installing some applications, or we are just pulling some base image from the Docker's hub repository, and then we are adding some stacks over it. But when we going to use Dockerignore is when we want to exclude some of the files at the build time, right? So let's take an example and see if we have multiple developers who are contributing to the same branch, right, for an application, and inside that application they have different segments upon which they are working, and when they are maintaining their own Docker files, and they are building the Docker files at the same place or in the same repository, right? So what they need to do is they would have to segregate their code from other developers, although they can use the branching strategies as well. But we are assuming that they are having some of the files residing on the same place which are not required in that particular application at the build time. What it will do is it will not only increase the size of the basic image or the total application image, but also it will unnecessarily would be occupying some of the space from the Docker image, right, that we're going to build. So Dockerignore is generally useful when we want to exclude some of the files when we are building some Docker image using Docker file, right? So let's head over to the terminal and see how we can do that. So I'm inside this directory, and let's see what we have. We have a single Docker file here. Let's see what this Docker file is doing. So this Docker file is just pulling that Ubuntu Nginx image and exposing it to port 80, and then it is trying to copy everything from the current directory to the container's root directory, right? And then it is running into the foreground. That's fine. So what will happen if we will build it using the build commands, right? So what it will do is it's going to build it in the same directory, and whatever things we do have in the same current directory, it is going to copy everything to the container's root directory. And in some of the cases which we do not want, right, let's say we will have to create some of the files here so that we can understand. So I'm trying to create file 1, file 2 and file 3, and let's say nginx.conf or any hello or test. So now we have all of these files, right? Okay, I have given space after files, that is why 2 and 3 are different. So let me remove 2 and 3. Okay, now we have just files here. So now what will happen is whenever we're going to build this Docker file, it is going to copy all of these files from this location to containers root directory, right? And let's say now I'm just working on some of the applications and I'm just customizing this nginx, right, into the container, and I'm copying some of the files from here. Then what it will do is it will unnecessarily copy all of these files again to a container's specific location that we do not want, right? So there could be multiple ways you can avoid this situation. You can use different folders, you can use different branching strategies, but just in case if we have some specific requirement where we would have to build all of the, let's say we would have multiple Docker files here, Docker file 1, Docker file 2, and so on, and other contributors are also placing their Docker files here in the same directory, but we specifically wants to, let's say I'm just creating this nginx image here. I'm pulling this nginx image and creating a Docker image using it, and my requirement is just to copy this nginx.conf into root directory or any specific directory, or I just can replace the default nginx.conf inside the container from this file. So what I can do is I can specifically use docker cp command, and inside the Docker file as well I can use copy command to copy this specific file only, right? But at the build time it will include all of the files which are residing into the same directory. So at the build time, if we want to ignore all of them, we can use Dockerignore. So how we can do that? Let's say we just make a hidden file by this name Dockerignore. So let me show you what will happen if we will, before Docker ignore, if we just build this image, what will happen, right? So, okay, I have Docker ignore here. So I'm just removing this Docker ignore. Now we just have removed it, and let's see what we can do. Okay, so I'm going to build this again. So if I say build and Docker file I have given, and I'm just using the same current directory, what it's going to do, it has just built this Docker Docker image, right? And if we see Docker images, we can see Docker ignore is just built 10 seconds ago. Now we're going to create a container using this docker-d, and now the container has been created. If we check docker ps, we have this running container here. Now, so since if we can see the Docker file, we have this command which is saying copy everything from current directory to container's root directory, right? Let's get inside the container and check if it has copied everything. And I just exec into it. And if I do cd, and this is the working directory, and here we can see it has copied everything, right? So we can see it has copied Docker file and file1, file2, everything that we have created there. This is what we do not want. Let's see if all of these files are required, but this Docker file is not required, and we do not want to copy this specifically. So what we can do is we can just maintain a Docker ignore file. Before that, let me delete this container and docker kill. Now it is done. Now we do not have anything. Now what we're going to do is in this current directory, we're going to create a file by the name dockerignore, and here we will specify what are the files that we want to exclude at the build time, right? So let's say I do not want Docker file to be built at the build time, and let's say I do not want, and also we can specify some of the parameters, like let's say if we have multiple files with the same extensions or something, right? Then we can say something like I do not want to include anything which is starting from file and then ending with anything, right? So now what it will do, this particular Docker file will ignore Docker file and any file which is starting from file and ending with anything, right? So I'm just saving this one, and we see Dockerignore is already here. And if we check the contents, then we can see Docker file, it will exclude this Docker file and anything which is starting from file. So it should not include Docker file, file and file1. These three things it should exclude. Other than that, it should include everything. So now let's build it again. So I'm going to build this file again, and then I'm going to run this. So now we have Docker container run. Let me clear the screen. And if you see Docker PS, now this particular Docker container is running. Now let's get inside the container and check whether it has excluded all of the files that we have mentioned earlier. And if I go to current directory and check, yes. So here we can see that it has excluded it has excluded files and anything which is starting from file and ending with anything. So file1 and file it has excluded, and it also excluded the Docker file. So this is what we use Docker file for, right? So this is a simple example that we can use Docker file for. Thanks for watching.